Welcome everyone to our first episode in the educational series focused on innovation and clinical trials, again in the area of transplantation. Today, we are looking specifically to new technology and new innovation in organ transplant. And my name is Karin Hehenberger. I'm the CEO of Lyfebulb. Lyfebulb is a company focused on bridging the gap between patient communities and industry, trying to deliver better products to the marketplace, really by raising the voice of the patient and interacting with individuals like we have with us today. So thank you to all of you out there listening, and we are hoping to address many of your questions today. So I'm joined today by two incredible individuals, Dr. Husain, who is from Columbia Presbyterian and is a nephrologist focused on transplantation, and Dave White, who is a patient living with a kidney transplant, but is very experienced in the field of working with new ideas, and also, again, as we have pointed out, being the voice for many patients and not just representing himself. Both of them have a strong track record in this space. And I wanted to ask the first question, really to set the stage, to understand from the physician perspective, as well as from the patient perspective, what are the biggest hurdles, the biggest areas in need of innovation that you see today from your specific point of view? We start with Dave, and welcome to you.
Oh, thank you, Karin, and thank you again for having me. In terms of what I think is needed in innovation, I think it would, for me, be pretty obvious that we need more kidneys from my perspective as a kidney transplant recipient who had to wait for years for that gift of life. This may also be important to people in need of other organs as well. But I know the kidney transplant waiting list is really long. I would like to see more focus on discarding fewer kidneys. I think maybe 1 in 5 available kidneys are discarded for some reason or another. And I'd like to see more pathways to donation. I'd like to see the barriers to organ donation for kidneys, being removed. So that would be my first ask. My second ask would be for just more knowledgeable patients. A lot of us, we just don't know what we don't know, but that's simply because we don't have the experience. I was listed at 3 transplant centers, and I didn't get much response from the first 2 for years. I was very fortunate at the place where I got transplanted to get the call the very next day after I was listed. I know that's like extremely rare, but years later, it was only 2 years later that I realized that the other 2 transplant centers may have declined often organ offers without my knowing it. Now, in retrospect, I was very fortunate, but if I was still on the waiting list and I just found that out, I would be very upset.
So 2 very important points Dave made. Number 1, an increase in supply, and specifically an increase in, or a decrease in the loss of kidneys that have been donated. So preserving kidneys or leveraging kidneys that have been donated and not losing them. And number 2, more education of patients earlier on, so that patients can be aware and be much more involved in the process. 2 great areas in need of innovation. So, Dr. Husain, what are your biggest areas that you would like to point out?
I think thankfully I have a lot of overlap with Dave, so I'm glad we're thinking the same things. But really, I think there's maybe I'll explain to 3 areas. So the first is, like, I think we need to somehow decrease our demand for organs. So I'll actually say 1 step upstream is that, can we do a better job of early identification of all the diseases that end up leading to organ failure, whether it's heart failure, lung failure, liver or kidney failure, And can we slow the progression of those things by identifying them earlier and developing better drugs to decrease the impact they have on organ function? The second thing, just like Mr. White said, is that can we make more organs available somehow through either improving allocation, through improving the technology, allowing us to use organs that previously were not usable, by getting organs that are transplanted to last longer so people don't have to get back on the wait list, but just expanding all the types of organs that we can do. And that will also bring in things like using experimental treatments like artificial organs or organs from genetically modified animals. And then finally, the third kind of way that we can decrease this demand and burden of organ failure is how can we get the organs that we do transplant to last longer? So how can we kind of improve the techniques that will prevent damage during the transplant process? How can we provide medications that protect them better from chronic immune damage? And how can we also develop medications that are less toxic? So for example, many patients who are on this call who have or transplant recipients are on either calcium inhibitors, either cyclosporin or tacrolimus. Everyone who kind of is on them, I'm sure, has heard that they increase your risk of high blood pressure, diabetes, and kidney disease. How can we develop medications or develop strategies to personalize immunosuppression to try to decrease those long-term consequences of being on the medications, or just develop better drugs?
So obviously, and I neglected to mention this in my intro. I also, of course, I'm a kidney transplant recipient, and I feel, very much in agreement with both of you here. I want to build on your second point and then go to the first one. The first one is really interesting with the actually I want to go to your third point and then go to your second. The third point being the new treatments. It is a fact that the drugs that we're on are all generic, with a few new ones, but we really have had not a really large increase in new products in this space. And to get a drug into the marketplace, as I think all of us here know, it takes more than 10 years, 10 to 15 years of research and development and clinical trial, and the risk to do so is immense. That's why pharmaceutical companies need the funding, I guess, for that. So what is it about the transplant space? Are there enough companies out there? Is there enough research? And what is it like to run a clinical trial in this space? If we go first to Dr. Husain.
Sure, that's a big question. I think it's something that we all grapple with ourselves also. Like, how do we increase the investment in this space? Because like you said, any new drug development is like a financial risk for a pharmaceutical company, which is why you see, a lot of pharmaceutical company strategies are kind of working on generic drugs, for example, right? And kind of modifying those because there's no risk. So I think kind of that ties into why we see underinvestment, is because two-part or multi-part problem of it being generally kind of compared to other things, like for example, cancer, hypertension, a small space, right? There's not that many transplant.
However, there are orphan diseases that have even less people in their markets.
Yeah, I think the second is that there's a perception that kind of among some people that like a lot of the drugs we have are good enough, right? Like, like right now, a lot of kidneys, a lot of hearts, lungs, and livers last a long time. So it's like, how can you, if you're going to try to break a drug into that space, it's got to be a drug that has either a lot less toxicity or has like such greater benefit that it can justify the, what will eventually be a high cost for the new drug. So, I think just a marginal improvement will be hard to justify to a payer. And therefore it's hard. And also, the immune system is a complicated part of your body. So the additional part is that like, it's a very complex problem we're trying to solve. Yeah, the last major drug that we had approved was belatacept, which was in 2011. So we think that's like 11 years ago. And we compare ourselves to other kind of complex fields. So things like cancer, I feel like you see a new commercial for a new cancer drug like every time you turn on the TV. So I do think that there's just there's room for a lot of advocacy from the transplant community to say, hey, like, we're doing okay, but we could be doing a lot better, and we need investment in this space from all the different parts of the transplant system, from the government.
So Dave, that's a point for you. Why do you think transplant patients are less aggressive in our advocacy, showing not just this enormous, being so grateful, because I think that's the perspective of the transplant patients. We're very grateful. You talked about the gift of life. I talk about the gift of life. We all do, and we are grateful. However, the gift of life needs also to allow us to thrive with the transplant, not just survive for 10, 15 years with a, which is great. It's better than being on dialysis. And I guess the comparison is so much better already. And that's what Dr. Husain is saying. But how do we mobilize our troops and get pharma companies, biotech companies to take that risk? What do you think we could do better?
Well, as one kidney transplant recipient who's thriving, speaking to another kidney transplant recipient who's thriving, I think we're very lucky. But with that said, I would say that it takes a lot of work to do that. It's, from my experience, it's constant. Next week I celebrate my 7th anniversary of my transplant from a deceased donor. And just in the last couple of weeks, in terms of maintenance, I've experienced something that I was experiencing in the first month, which is I'm this close to running out of immunosuppressants, one of my 3 immunosuppressant dosages. It's kind of ridiculous that that's happening, 7 years out, someone who has had as much experience, not only as a transplant recipient, but as a kidney transplant advocate.
Mm-hmm.
This shouldn't be a problem. I think that's one of the barriers to galvanizing our community. We spend a lot of energy just maintaining our transplant and keeping our quality of life at the level it is it's at, or trying to improve it.
When you say you're running out of drug, you mean that you're not getting it from your pharmacy?
It's a supply chain, and if there's one break, if one person does the wrong thing in the chain, it's a problem. Last week, I was literally on my last dose of one of my immunosuppressants, and it talk about just-in-time delivery. I received the shipment just in time where I didn't miss a dose, and I can, and when times are going good, I can count on my hand the number of dosages that I miss in a year. 7 years out, and it's still a panic situation when it comes to immunosuppressants.
Dave, I got to tell you, it has happened to me as well, and it's really terrifying when it does, and it should be easier. Yes. So the two of you pointed out 2 very important points. I think the supply demand, and Dr. Husain mentioned that in 2 ways, and then the second one, the drugs. I think that is another big unmet need. The third one that you kind of mentioned, Dave, and you're mentioning now, is this very difficult management of the process, right? It's very difficult to be a transplant patient. Got to refill your prescriptions, got to take your drugs, you got to live with this fear to a certain extent. The mental health is always needs to be managed. I think one of my most important learnings from talking to both patients and physicians was the example in diabetes, where when you ask people with diabetes, what is your big desire? What is it that you really want as a diabetes patient? And most patients with diabetes say that I don't have to think about diabetes anymore, because the constant management of blood glucose, the constant management of ups and downs, and the insulin injection, it causes so much stress. So they don't want to think about diabetes. And the physician's big desire for their patient is to have perfect glucose control, which really contradict each other. So in the transplant process, if we didn't have to think about this transplant, management all the time, I think there would be more room for, other things. So that's, to me, a third area of innovation that we'd like to get to. And talking about that, Dr. Husain, you did mention some experimental ideas, maybe xeno, maybe cell. What are some of those that are on the horizon?
Sure. I think the hot thing in everyone's mind right now is xenotransplant, or transplant from a kind of different species. So talking about an animal organ into a human. And I think everyone has seen that basically in the past year, we've had a lot of progress in this area, largely due to the success of gene editing technology over the last several years. So we know that there have been now a few pig kidneys that have been transplanted into brain dead human recipients. And kind of the reason they do it like that is they want to just proof of concept that it can be transplanted into a human who has some biologic function, just to make sure that there's no acute rejection of the hyperacute rejection of the organ. But those have gone well. And then I'm sure everyone also saw that there's a patient in Maryland who was a heart failure patient who received a heart from a genetically modified pig. And I think this kind of progress in this area has been exponentially fast compared to what we traditionally see. And I'd say that's really a kind of hot topic and an area that has a huge potential to fit the unmet need for the amount of organs available. So the other thing that I think is—
let me ask a question on that,
Yes.
though, because that solves for the first issue, which is the supply demand. But does it solve for the immune suppression? Do you still need immune suppression if you get a xenotransplant?
You do. And kind of that actually is going to go right to my second point, which is that what it doesn't solve is that, no one wants to get a pig transplant every 5 years, every 10 years, right? There's still a lot of burden and cost associated with that. And I think the second half of what's happening now in terms of technological advances is like around that space of like, how do we protect these organs in the least intrusive way possible, in the least toxic way possible? There's a couple ways that that's happening. So one front that we're making some progress on is just understanding kind of individual needs for immunosuppression. There's been a lot of advances in genetics also over the past decade in understanding genetics in terms of both how much immunosuppression do you need as a patient for the organ that you have. So being able to minimize for patients where it's possible, or kind of increase immunosuppression in cases where we might have been under immunosuppressing in the past. So that will help protect the organ and potentially decrease the amount you have to get.
And are those technologies, do you measure certain parameters? How does that work to do individualized immune suppression?
Yeah, I think a lot of that in terms of what's happening now is better understanding the ways in which you are mismatched or matched with the donor whose organ kind of has been gifted to you. And kind of, our previous ways of thinking about matching were very rudimentary compared to what we have now. Just a couple of what we call HLA loci, and we've expanded way beyond that to understand how we can tailor immunosuppression from person-to-person basis. And potentially, in the future, also understanding person-to-person differences in drug metabolism and drug response. So, I'm sure anyone who hears a transplant, let's say, if for any kidney transplant recipient, I'm sure at least 10 other kidney transplant recipients, and I'm sure you guys are all in the same exact dose of Cellcept or Myfortic, and you're like, hey, how come, I'm 6 foot and 200 pounds, and my friend here is 5'5" and 100 pounds, and why are we on the same dose of Cellcept? And he's 2 years out and I'm 10 years out. This makes no sense, right? So kind of understanding person-to-person variation is an important part of reducing or I guess not reducing, but right-sizing the amount of drug that you're getting. And the second is there are technologies and technological advances in kind of towards what we call tolerance. So how can we achieve a transplant that does not require immunosuppression at all? And kind of the exact science behind that, I think, is a little too complex for this forum. But just know that there are potential ways that we can do things to the immune system using some kind of some transfer of immune system from the donor that could potentially obviate the need totally for chronic immunosuppression. I think that's really far in the future. So certainly
there's a company that does that, though. There's a company that has a trial that's doing that.
Yes. We have a trial here at Columbia too that we're just starting as well.
Right. So it's although it's far out, it's being conducted. Dave, we've have some comments here from I think most of the questions have been answered, but one question from one of our non-US, and this is something that comes up often, is we talk about how difficult it is for pharma companies to do clinical trials and the cost, and the access to drugs. Is this something that is global? Or is it when you're in a state-financed country like mine, Sweden, do we suddenly have access to all drugs more easily, or Canada? Maybe, I don't know if Dave, you want to take this, or if Dr. Husain, any one of you. I could take it otherwise. I mean, it's, but please go ahead.
Well, I would just quickly say that as I often say in my daily life, I'm not thinking that far ahead. You know, I'm just thinking about, you know, what I need to get through the day and,
Yeah.
you know, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, I can respond to it. You know, in countries where the government pays for your healthcare, the government decides which drugs to pay for. And that means that if those drugs have not shown in America, you know, we use two authorities for approving drugs based on efficacy and safety, the FDA, and then we have CMS for addressing whether it's a cost benefit or not. And in countries such as England or Sweden, and probably Canada, there is a kind of a mix between the two. So there has to be a cost benefit as well as an efficacy safety benefit. And if those are not fulfilled, and this is, by the way, the case in all of Europe now, those drugs aren't even approved. So some drugs that are approved in America that have maybe a smaller efficacy benefit than you know, that doesn't see that, according to these authorities, don't show a cost benefit, are not even approved, so they're not even available. That's the short answer. So if you're looking for the cutting edge innovation, you will be in an environment where there will be a problem with access. Dr. Husain, I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, I totally agree. Nothing you said that I can disagree with. You know, unfortunately, it sometimes comes down to dollars and cents, which often is not a good thing for the individual patients. Yeah.
No, it's but it's, you know, the average patient will get their drugs. It's just that when you have a need for the absolute newest treatments, you're going to have to wait a few years, or maybe they will never be approved. Back to clinical trials and you know, some of these technologies that Dr. Husain mentioned. I think, you know, taking advantage of what has been happening in other disease areas such as oncology. You mentioned oncology drugs are coming all along. You know, is there something we can learn from that, not just from the advocacy perspective, but from the science? You know, oncology development in some ways is the reverse of transplant. You know, is there something that you think that we can learn in repositioning drugs?
I think from my perspective, it's just that, like, I think that there's not any one particular thing, but I think it's just a culture of constant innovation and well-run trials. You know, I think that the thing that makes oncology so successful is that they have a lot of buy-in from their patients to participate in trials, and they have a lot of effort from funders to support the trials, from pharmaceutical companies to develop good trials, and from physicians to run the trials, right? And I don't think necessarily we need to kind of borrow any of their specific scientific ideas, but I think their culture of constantly improving is a good one. And, you know, that's how they've had success. And if you go to any big name, cancer center, so all the ones you want to think about, like, you know, Dana-Farber or Sloan Kettering, you know, every time a patient comes, they're just given lots of information about the potential trials they could be involved in. And it's for patients for stage 1 or stage 2, or who have failed prior therapy or have never tried therapy, right? There's something for everyone if they want to participate. I think that's really how the field moves forward.
So Dave, your experience here, you've been part of some clinical trials, mostly as a kidney patient versus a transplant patient. How do you see, I mean, if your physician were to approach you with the idea of joining a clinical trial, would you be open to it?
I would definitely be open to it. I know first from being an advocate and, you know, being involved, I know that my doctor probably wouldn't approach me if I wasn't a good candidate. Mm-hmm. So, and also if it's my doctor approaching me, that's a person that I can trust. You know, it's very important that that first ask comes from someone that I know. So it's a much more comfortable conversation. So that's the first hurdle. You know,
so you wouldn't react well to a clinical trial that you saw on Facebook or Instagram. You'd rather it come from your physician.
Well, it's whatever the person's most comfortable with. If you're comfortable with learning it from Facebook or, you know, from a colleague, that's fine. doctor, I'm open to all. I want to know. I think the first step to participating in a trial is knowing about it. So, and hopefully that first touch is a comfortable touch, but I think, knowledge is the first step.
Yep. Yep. There's a question here from the audience asking to compare to COVID. We've compared a lot to oncology. I think the other area to compare to is HIV, right? There's been enormous advocacy in bringing HIV is controllable now. I mean, maybe even curable at some point, while in transplant, as you said, the most recent drug was in 2011. Does the government have anything to do with this? Because with COVID, there was, what was it called? Operation Warp Speed, or, we really got those vaccines out quickly. Can the government do anything here to help with approvals?
Yeah, I think a little bit of a politically charged question, but I'll answer it anyway. But, I think that, I think everyone's trying to do the right thing always, right? If we can start saying that, the government doesn't intend to get in the way. But I think there's certainly an issue of bureaucracy, slow approvals, that kind of, and removing that red tape and potentially that those things that kind of slow progress can play a role in hastening the development of new drugs. But I think that the key part of Operation Warp Speed that we need to think about is there's a ton of money pumped into a lot of different ideas, right?
Right.
And if you look at like the number of different companies that got money to explore their ideas, it was astounding. And that's why you have vaccines that are mRNA vaccines, traditional vaccines, right? And virus vector vaccines, like you have all different kinds, they're all being tested. And even like this year, there are new vaccines still being approved, even though we have great vaccines already. And I think that's, I don't want you to think I only think you talk about money, but I think in like getting a good financial investment is the first step to innovation, because that is what's going to kind of support, like, like paying the scientists to do the work, funding the clinical trial, reducing the financial risk of all those things. That's really where we get people motivated to work in a space. Because, to compare it to things like COVID or HIV or oncology, if they know that they have a big pool of people to work on, exciting new areas to work on, the way to say, hey, transplant's cool too, is to say, look at the impact you can make. And also here's a support we're going to give you to make sure that you have the tools to succeed in our space as well.
So question for you, Dr. Husain. I'm sure you are, as a professor at Columbia, you're also teaching young medical students. Is there an interest in the transplant space among the young students? Because I think that's a real need. We need, the top students to get into the space.
I think there really is. So actually for our, at Columbia, I gave the talk during our kidney pathophysiology course about the introduction of transplants. And like every time I give that talk every year, I get a bunch of students that email me saying, this is so cool. Can I see a transplant surgery? Can I see your transplant clinic? All these things about transplant, because it's like one of these really unique areas of medicine where we can take a patient whose prognosis is poor or might be very, very sick and really do a life-changing thing.
Yeah.
I tell a lot of students that like something that's similar to your transplant surgery is like the day that if you're a woman who gives birth, the day you give birth, like, so you always remember this like really monumental day that changed the course of your life forever, or your wedding, right? The whoever officiated your wedding. And I think people appreciate the innovation and just like the cool factor of like making a huge difference. Yeah. So I do think, and there's a lot of different parts of the science, right? Immunology, it's basic physiology, it's health services research. There's a lot of interest in transplants. And I think just kind of continuing to fund those projects, it's a good way to get those students interested as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Dave, from your perspective, you're an advocate and you represent many transplant patients. Do you also interact with patients from other disease areas? And how do you see the pecking order, among those other organizations? Do you see that the transplant patients are being heard and listened to as well?
I think we can do a better job. I definitely do. In my interactions with other communities, I see movement in that space. And just overall, I see, the power dynamic is very slowly shifting. We've gone from patient engagement to patient empowerment. And I see patient power coming on.
Fantastic.
Yeah. An hour or so before this call, I get inspirational messages on my phone, and the one that came up today is from Margaret Wheatley. There's no power for change greater than a community discovering what it cares about. And I think we're right on the cusp of that in the transplant community.
There's no doubt that this space is cool. I mean, what can be more cool than, transplantation? I mean, you're saving a life, you're doing it through fantastic surgery, but you also need science where the immunology is there, and then, getting a new organ to work in a body. I mean, that's incredibly interesting. And the patients really change. It's not like it's incremental, it's monumental, the change. So now maybe we need our stories to be out there, louder and better. If someone in our audience asked the question, and this is a good question, I think, are we sharing research across different countries? Are we listening to what's going on in countries like Israel that has, great science, or Europe or Asia? Is there is a good communication in the transplant research space?
Yeah, I would say I'll take this one. Sorry, Dave.
Yeah, no, please go ahead.
I think absolutely there is. I think it's one beautiful thing about the scientific community is that that we're very well connected. So I think everyone knows what everyone else is having success with, and I think you see that a lot of the most recent kind of exciting work that's happening is stuff that's happening across borders. So even here, right, like at Columbia, we have collaborators in places like France. I know that across like England, France, the entire Euro transplant group, Israel, like a lot of the work that was being done, for example, in COVID and kidney transplant recipients, was happening very, very quickly across multiple sites. And I think that, that's really the only way forward nowadays, is that we know that the more people we can get to work on the same project effectively in unison, the more progress we can make.
That's great. That's wonderful. And just understanding that the power of the team and working together is more important than that individual success of the surgeon or the patient advocate, right? It's all about getting the results. We're approaching the final portion here of our conversation, and we could go on because there's so much in innovation. You've talked about the biggest needs that you see from your perspectives. What is the most near-term, realistic, tangible development that you can picture right now, that we can say to our audience, you will see this in the next 3 years? Is there anything? And here, think broadly. Devices, could be community platforms, could be, drugs take long, but is there anything out there that you think will reach patients within the next 3 years that we can tell our audience to look out for?
I hate to be the person that doesn't answer a question perfectly, but there's got to be two. I need to have two. I can't just do one.
That's okay.
One is xenotransplant. I think we're almost there, and I really think that'll do a huge service to the transplant patient community by expanding the number of organs available. I think we're very, very close. It's happening. It's going to happen during all of our lifetimes. But I think the second thing is something that you said, which is like the patient engagement and patient empowerment angle. And I think that, like, not just saying that because it's a Lyfebulb webinar, like it's really the thing that's changing everything, right? Because that's what's driving changes in policy to make things better, to make things more efficient, to make things more effective. And if we think about even the biggest thing that's happened, for example, in the kidney world recently, in terms of like the last administration's kidney health initiatives,
yep.
Right? The reason that happened, or not the only reason, but Alex Azar's connection to this problem was that his father was a kidney patient who then had a kidney transplant, right? So that patient empowerment, kind of hearing people's voices, putting yourselves out there to say this is something that we need, that has the ability to make a huge change in kind of how the whole system operates. And as the system operates in a more patient-centric way, which is something we were talking about before kind of this webinar started, that's really how everything else falls into place. And I think that's the thing that's changing everything, in my opinion.
Thank you. Dave?
I think that not only did Dr. Husain hit the nail on the head, I see the two being intertwined. There's a lot of hesitancy in the transplant community regarding xenotransplantation. The only way to overcome that is going to be through greater communication and more transparency, shared decision-making. I see that opening up in the next few years, and I'm happy to be in a position to help make that happen.
Thank you. I want to thank both of you. This has been such a dynamic discussion, and you know, I really, really appreciate it. I've learned a lot, and I feel really confident that we will get there. And I think the patient empowerment leading to patient power, I love it. Engagement to empowerment to power, and working very closely. I mean, just the fact that the three of us are having this conversation on a very equal basis today, you know, listening to each other and you know, being appreciative of our the three experiences is a big step forward. I also want to thank CSL Bering for sponsoring this seminar series, and of course Columbia Presbyterian for being our partner, and Dave, you know, you're just our hero. So if you want to continue the conversation, go to transplantlyfe.com, and we can continue to ask and answer questions. So thank you so much, and I'll see you very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you all.